Ruth, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to put in the chat sort of today's toolkit, and hopefully that link will give you access to download that. But also, I know, like, especially for people on mobile devices, it might be a little more difficult to download or even use some of those things. But you can also share this in a way that can be downloaded. But this will be what we're working through, and I will share the this my on my screen as well. But I just want to make sure that you all had a chance to see that for yourselves and to use it however you want to. But I am Nick Philbeck, and I'm the Restorative Justice Case Manager at CJM, which stands for Community Justice and Mediation Center here in Bloomington, Monroe County. And we're an independent nonprofit organization, but we do receive referrals from various places, including from the court system, but from like just individuals in any kind of conflict situation, or even just to facilitate conversations about various things. But a lot of my focus in my work, especially with youth, it involves youth who are involved in some way with the criminal justice system, or have caused harm in some kind of way or experienced harm in some kind of way. And so that's a lot of the focus of the conflict resolution work that I end up doing a lot. But with this overall focus, we really want to talk about a variety of different kinds of interpersonal problems, different kinds of things that might be of concern to people. And so with that in mind, we want to explore conflict really openly in terms of like what that might look like, or what kind of interpersonal problems might there be for youth, and also even for yourselves too. I mean, these skills are more focused toward youth, but they are fundamental to things for adults too. And I know for myself, I find myself using these things a lot. So again, for those of you just joining, or if you want to download the toolkit we're going to be using directly, I just put it in the chat there. But also, like, I know, like on mobile devices, it might be more difficult. So again, I'll put in the chat a way to access that as well. But I started with this work as a volunteer for CJM back when I was 16 years old. So I had started doing this kind of work even when I was a youth. And with this, a lot of the things that really attracted me to just working with different kind of conflict situations and helping people through mediation and different things is there were a lot of things that really attracted me, but I remember one story really stood out, and it was about a situation where, let's call these kids Maggie and Lisa. So we have these two sisters, and they're at home. They go to the refrigerator, and there's one orange left in the whole house. And they both want it real bad. And so they end up fighting over it. And then their mom, let's call her Marge, comes in and sees these girls fighting and is trying to figure out, okay, what the heck do I do? What is going on? What are your thoughts? Put in the chat here, just what do you think Marge could do to help in this situation? Say cut the orange in half. Yep, cut the orange in half. A lot of cutting the orange in half. See a timeout. Ruth, you're the outlier for the moment. Why do you say timeout versus cutting the orange in half?
It just gives people a pause to think a bit.
Okay. So yeah, staying calm, don't escalate. So a few of you are just wanting to kind of think through things, take some time to process. Yeah. So yeah, when I first heard this story, the way it was told to me was that Marge, like, her solution was like a couple of you said, like, cut the orange in half. And if your principles around how to deal with conflict are about like what's fair, what's equal, maybe those kinds of things might lead you to that sort of solution. One issue with that, though, is that Maggie wanted the orange because she just wanted to eat the actual like orange. She was feeling a little sick, maybe it's flu season. Like she really wanted to get that vitamin C. She wanted to get some of that sweet sugar, like feel good, enjoy the orange. Lisa, on the other hand, did not care about that part of the orange because she needed the orange to bake a cake and needed the peel. So cutting the orange in half, I mean, it's not the worst, but there's a solution kind of staring us in the face that could have been a lot better to meet both of their needs. And there's a solution that maybe, if again, if you take that time to process it, might have been a different result. Now, to me, that stood out because one of the things that we focus on, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about this today, is about really focusing on, instead of trying to jump into problem solving, and this is what we do a lot just in any part of our daily life, is we try to jump into trying to solve problems a lot of times before we necessarily know like what the problems are, why they're problems, or what we really need in a situation. And especially if you are trying to jump in and help people try to resolve their problems that they're having, if you jump in with a solution before really understanding like what people's needs are, what their interests are, what their concerns, what it is that they really value out of this moment, it's probably not as likely that you're going to be that helpful as it would be if you understood some of those things a bit deeper. So we want to talk about that in terms of, at CGM, we talk about it in terms of like problem framing before problem solving. Tends to be something that in a lot of ways helps everything be a lot more efficient once you understand like what are the needs, what are the things that sort of can give you a foundation to work toward a good solution. So you understand like what are the principles, what are the criteria that need to be met for a good solution. So for instance, like if Lisa wanted to bake that cake, then like having the ingredients to bake a cake would be criteria for a good solution for her. Whereas like having something delicious to eat that also has good vitamin C for Maggie might have been criteria that need to be met for her. So, you can find a solution pretty easily with that one orange to meet both of their needs. Now, there are situations perhaps where they both want the same part of that orange, or they both want all of it. And that's another thing we need to consider in terms of like, what are the rules that you might come up with now? So if you, as Marge, are listening to them say that they both want the same thing, they both want all the orange, what do you do? Or how do you make that decision about how to handle that? You can put in the chat what your thoughts are, or if you want to unmute and speak up, you can do it that way. So who came to the orange first? The criteria you would use, or just whoever got to it first is the winner. Who has gotten the oranges historically? Aha. So maybe you have people in a household. I know, like you go to the store, you bring home like a big bag of oranges or something, a dozen oranges or something. And one person's already had 10, 11 of those. And now all of a sudden one person just wants one and the other person still wants that 12th. To indicate the urgency or need of each party. Uh-huh. We're having the conversation with the girls and letting them select the solution. Mm. Yeah. There are a lot of different approaches that you could take, and all of them have different sort of histories behind them in terms of like why you come to those. But all of us have our own histories of these things. And especially when we think about like for youth, how we approach these things as like whether you're a parent or whether you're a teacher or a youth worker, any of those kinds of things, how you handle even those little moments can have a really big impact on how people start to view these kinds of things as they go forward. So for instance, if you as a family like handle those things by who gets to it first, then a lot of times like that can be a principle that then drives you in a lot of other decisions, or feels like that is the right way to handle things. but maybe in certain situations, that's not the best way to handle it. Same thing goes for like who has had the most or who has gotten more oranges historically. Like if, if you go based on that principle in this situation, it might be something that people learn. And maybe that's useful in certain situations. And maybe in certain situations, it really isn't as useful as other criteria. I don't know. But that's why when we're talking about the problem framing piece, we're also talking about how we even go about trying to solve these problems. So figuring out not just like what are good solutions going to be, but even like what are good practices in terms of just how we handle conflicts, how we handle these questions of like who gets what or who gets to do what. So we'll talk about all those things as we go forward today. But I appreciate you all sharing those things. I think it's important to keep each of those things in mind. So as we go forward into thinking through all these different kind of conflict resolution things, I'm going to share my screen. But again, Ruth, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat again for those who have joined a little bit later, just about the ways to they can access this toolkit for themselves. Uh, Hopefully that didn't go to the right place. I don't think I'm going to try to share my screen again. Hopefully this goes to the correct place. There we go. Okay, so you should be able to see this PDF of this, and hopefully this is a good size. If this isn't a good size for you to read, you can actually, if you're on a computer, if you move your mouse toward the top, there's something that says like view options, and you select zoom ratio, and you can set whatever zoom ratio you want, so it'll be whatever size you want it to be. You also have my contact information, so we'll have some time toward the end here for some questions or comments, but you can also contact me directly, and I'll also be there tomorrow at the event. So for those of you who are there, I'd certainly love to connect with any of you. So I want to focus on these principles for like healthy conflict resolution. And especially with this being like a local summit and being focused on Monroe County, being in Indiana, might as well go with euchre as a way to remember some of these principles, right? About just how we want to handle conflict resolution. So in those practices, in terms of like for yourself, in terms of things that you might want to think about, but even just thinking about the process overall of like how you go about resolving conflicts. These principles are ones that I found really, really important in my work, but also just in my life. Like I said, I started doing this work when I was 16, and immediately some of these principles were things that I found useful in my life right away in terms of relating with my family. Although my mom is in this meeting right now, and I don't know how effective she would say that I did with these, but you know, I did try to utilize some of these skills in my regular personal life. But so hopefully these things are useful for you too. But we'll talk through tools that go with each of these things. But one thing that I want to focus on first is like efficacy. So self-efficacy, sometimes called like efficacy expectations, or different places will use different terminology, but essentially like for these purposes, it's an individual's belief that they'll be able to successfully exert control within a process in healthy ways, coupled with the belief that their engagement in that process will lead to good outcomes. So right away, one of the things that we just know about humans in general is that we don't tend to be as ready to do things or do things as often if we feel like we're not good at it. And we definitely don't do it if we feel like if doing it won't matter. And those are things that for a lot of youth, especially when they approach conflict situations, those are two thoughts that get into their minds right away. And then probably for a lot of you as adults, those are thoughts that enter your minds from time to time, if not on a regular basis, that maybe I'm just like not very good at handling conflict. Maybe I'm just not like really someone who can really engage in this in a way that is going to matter. I know in a lot of especially like long-standing relationships, people can start to feel like nothing I do is going to matter, so why bother? I'll just deal with the consequence. I'll just deal with it. for a lot of kids, they can feel like, I don't have any power in this situation. I don't have any control. So like, why should I engage in this? Why should I care? Especially working with youth who are going through criminal justice system, that can be something that they've experienced maybe throughout their lives in terms of like getting used to a pattern of anytime they do something and then an adult intervenes, they feel like, well, the adult's just going to tell me what I need to do, and I just need to figure out like how to just go through the things that they tell me to do and get it over with. And it can feel very disengaging for people. So thinking about how can you set up places where people can feel like they have some kind of power in a situation, how they feel like being involved in it, doing something will actually matter to them, will actually make a difference potentially. And also, again, feeling like me actually actively engaging in this is something that could be good for me, or I could actually be successful in this, are two things that are really difficult, but can be really powerful for people. So with that piece of it, I'm going to go down to our first sort of tool, which is this cognitive behavioral map. And the idea of this is like essentially looking at how actions happen. So you have these events, could be internal, like thoughts that you have, or an external event that happens to you. Think through like, what are your automatic thoughts? So what are the expectations that you have? And self-efficacy is one of those like expectations. So like what expectations you have, what appraisals. So like essentially what kind of value are you giving to certain things? Attributions. So like what do you think is causing this? Who do you think is at fault? Those kinds of things. And then like decisions you make. So a lot of times like you start to make decisions. Your brain is trying to help you figure out what to do right away. But we hear a lot from youth, like they say, oh, I just did it, I wasn't really thinking, or like I do a lot of these things without really thinking, like I don't think. That's not really true, but it can definitely feel that way because a lot of things happen very automatically, very quickly. And so looking through this cognitive behavioral map, one of the things that can be really helpful sometimes is for people who feel like they don't have any control over the things that they do, or feel like they don't really have power to really think through things or control things in a moment, is to take that time to evaluate it. Look at, okay, how did you get from point A to point B? How did you go from this situation where like you were hungry and maybe stressed out to getting in a fight with somebody? Like how did that happen? There are going to be thoughts, there are going to be events along the way. So what are those events that happen that got there? What are those things that you started to think? What were the feelings that you had? So looking through those things can really help people start to break it down a little bit. And by doing that, there are actually ways that people can then affect their behavior in new situations. So that kind of thinking, by practicing that thinking, it does help. So when you're in situations that happen really quickly, you can actually engage your brain in a way that will help do that. So one thing that tends to help with that are doing like thinking reports, is a pretty simple way of doing things. So for instance, that's like writing a factual description of things. When it says factual, one of the things that's helpful for people too is feeling like, I mean, when I was talking about feeling like you're good at something can be a really important piece of wanting to do it or even trying to do it, or feeling like you could have success. One thing is to not judge yourself as a person based on these actions that you take. And for us, in working with youth, especially, one of the things that's really important is to not make them feel like we are judging them as people, not treating them as bad people, even if they've done things that are harmful. Like that does not make them a bad person. The actions are not the person. Those actions are things that can be addressed. Those actions are things, that we can look at and try to respond to. But for some people, that can be a really challenging thing. So, for instance, we work with youth, for instance, who've had like substance abuse issues, or people who've been addicted to like stealing or shoplifting, or have had a lot of difficulty just with lying automatically as like a behavior that they have just go off immediately to. And so, rather than trying to treat it as like, oh well, you need to stop it cold turkey, like everything's just going to be totally fine, think about it as like thinking through some of the moments when those things have happened in the past and trying to go through some of these thinking reports sometimes gives people insight into how they can change their thinking in the next time a similar situation comes up, or even thinking through what are situations that put me at risk. So these thinking reports can sometimes help break it down for people to start to figure out what is going to make a difference for them. It also helps people take away some of the judgment that they might have of their over their own behaviors or their feelings of not having control. So sometimes these by doing this is something that takes these things that feel out of control or feel like they're never going to be able to do anything about it, and making it something that they are able to respond to in a way that takes away some of that self-judgment and some of those feelings of shame that can be really harmful for people, and make it something where they are try to address it and take it seriously, but don't take it to be something that is automatically determinative of who they will be as a person. Does anybody have questions about this? If you do, feel free to unmute and speak up, so I don't have everybody on my screen right now. Yeah. And it's just one particular tool. And again, these things, some of these might be helpful in certain conflict situations, or even just thinking through how you deal with particular behaviors. But you know, not all these things are going to be useful for everybody. I like in a session this morning, Shatoya Moss was talking about how she was putting at pieces out there for people and sort of to take through. And she was saying something about like, you know, when you're making soup, the goal is just to have something to eat at the end. You can choose your own ingredients. And I feel like with this too, you know, using some of these tools might be useful, but really going back to these principles, I think are really the most important piece. So finding ways that you can achieve these with the people you're working with or in your own lives is what is most important. So with the U in euchre, we have understanding. So activating perspectival skills. So part of that is understanding our own perspective. So thinking through like from our vantage point, like understanding is a process of attributing meaning to experience. And that's one of those things too, when we talk about a cognitive behavioral map, where like the things that we start to think right away are going to be based on our own experiences, based on the things we've gone through. And so for youth in particular, like each experience they have is such a small part of their life, but like it's going to have a really, really, really strong impact on how they then behave. And over time, those things can become more ingrained. So figuring out like how is it that we've attributed meaning to our experiences? What are the meanings that we've given to the things that we've experienced in our lives? And how is that informing our behavior is a really important aspect to think about. Communication is behavior to which others attribute meaning. So thinking through like how might other people be interpreting these things, or even like what is the meaning I'm attributing to what other people are doing. And so that helps us in thinking through like perspective taking. So part of that's like for me trying to just get in the mind of or get in the shoes of someone else. But perspective seeking and perspective coordination are really important aspects that are sometimes not talked about quite as much. So a tool for this is looking through some of these skills in terms of like communication. So for one thing is like taking responsibility for one's own perspective can be a really important piece of things. And one way that I found helpful is I messages or I statements. You might hear those terms used interchangeably. They involve the speaker really assuming responsibility for their own thoughts, their own perspectives. So saying like, I feel this way when this happens, or I feel this way because of this. So give an example there. You statements are more like, you didn't do the dishes. You don't care about how I feel. You're disrespectful. Some of those things are like making certain judgments about things, but also just like assuming certain things. So, you know, even if you see like the dishes weren't done, they might have been done before you got there, but then that person might have gotten hungry and just just now ate. There are a variety of possibilities. But sometimes too in these situations, like the fact that the dishes weren't done doesn't necessarily mean that that person doesn't care about how you feel. There might be ways that you can talk about things without taking it to that level, which might lead people to shut down and not really engage with you. and not really take those things seriously, or not really even take your concerns seriously. So a lot of times iMessages can help in terms of making sure that people do listen to what you have to say and don't feel as defensive. But they can also be helpful because you can speak from your own perspective. And there's a lot of power in taking that ownership of your own perspective. And hopefully the person listening will take that seriously too, and recognize that you are speaking from your own experience, your own perspective, and acknowledging the fact that like you are the one who holds the truth about what you've experienced, what you feel, what you think. Do caution like being careful about, there's a temptation to start out with an I message and immediately make it a you message by saying things like, I feel frustrated when you don't respect me. Uh, I would advise you like not to do that, but sometimes it can be useful to say things like, I feel disrespected because I worry that you might not be respecting our agreement. Part of that too is again like talking from your own perspective about things, talking about your own concerns, even if that is in relation to things with another person. But part of that too is like being able to engage with them seriously and giving them a chance to respond to that and respond to your concerns, respond to how you feel, can be a really important aspect. And these are things that again we have done a lot with youth, and it's something that a lot of youth tend to grasp these ideas pretty well with certain like scripted kinds of things like the I feel. And it's something that is remarkably like simple but not easy, but it's something that again the more you work on it, the more you practice it in speaking in these terms, the more that communication can sometimes be more effective than using some of those other like you statements and those kinds of things. In terms of trying to understand other kind of aspects of a situation, so I mean we have we sometimes we'll use what we call like powerful prompts. So there's a list of them on the next page, but really the goal of this list is like incomplete, and it's there are lots of different ways you can do this, but these are some of the goals for this. So when I talked about like problem framing, thinking through like what are the criteria that need to be met for a good solution or a good outcome, these are some of the criteria I feel like should be met by these sort of prompts that you would bring up in a conflict situation or trying to resolve interpersonal problems. These are the principles that I think can really animate that. So thinking through like, how do you understand effectively communicate with others? How do you think through effects on other people? Especially for youth, these things tend to be very difficult, and for adults too, but especially just with the brain development of youth, these are really, really difficult things to tackle. But starting from one's own perspective is a little bit easier than trying to think through, like, for instance, how another person might feel in a situation. So instead of asking them like, how does this person feel? They might have a harder time saying that because it's more removed than saying like, how would you feel if you were in that situation? So sometimes again, engaging with people where they are and then trying to expand the fact that like I talk about like a limit of the golden rule. So the golden rule is fine in terms of like thinking through like treat other people how you want to be treated. It's a rule that can work fine enough in a lot of situations, but not everybody is the same. Not everybody feels the same way about things. Not everybody wants to be treated the same way. And so getting to that next step of not just thinking through how would you feel in this situation or how would you want to be treated, but then taking that next step of realizing how does another person want to be treated? How does another person feel in this situation? The fact that they can feel something different is something that can be very, very difficult for people. Just even recognizing the fact that someone could feel differently in a situation can sometimes be a barrier, but trying to help people understand that can be a big piece of approaching conflict in ways that are healthy for people. And then thinking through also the how their actions affect people beyond their immediate is something again people have a lot of difficulty with, but can be really important to think about. So even if in a particular situation, something you do, it might have been like not like one person might have seen the way you were treating someone, and like maybe the person that you hurt that you harmed, what has since made up with you. Maybe it was somebody you were a friend with, and like you called them a name that they, at first reacted to kind of negatively, but then you're able to patch it up. But somebody else might have seen you treat them that way and still be really hurt by that, still be really bothered, might still feel really unsafe being around you. And so thinking through like how other people might see those actions, how other people who might not be as immediate could be affected by those things can be really important. Thinking through like when you have, fights with your siblings, how that affects your family situation, how that affects, things going on. If mom and dad are fighting, how can that affect, kids? All those kinds of things I think are important to think about in terms of those other people who can be affected by things that happen just in a particular moment. But also thinking through like for a lot of you, thinking through how they can impact the systems around them can be a real challenge. And so that's something too, like trying to engage them and thinking through how can they have that power. So when we talked about that first part, that self-efficacy, how can they feel like they can actually impact things around them can be an important thing to think about. So being responsive to their own needs and the needs of others can be important. Also, youth tend to have a hard time like gauging risk or making sort of useful assessments of like what kind of harm they could do to themselves or others, or how others have been harmed. And so some of those things are things that we try to accomplish through some of these prompts. So again, these are just ideas of things that can prompt some of that thinking. So certain situations, either if you are approaching it for yourself, maybe thinking through these questions can help you think about a conflict differently, can help you think through how you want to approach it. But they can also be things that can help when you're working with people to ask these kinds of questions or to prompt this kind of thinking can sometimes be really helpful in terms of shifting how people are viewing things or how they're behaving in a conflict situation. In particular, when we talk about like those perspectival things, these are things that prompt that perspective taking. So especially like this aspect of it is the perspective taking components of things. So we talk about like inferring, anticipating the thoughts of other people. And these parts are more about the perspective seeking. So trying to figure out like what information do you have available to you from another person? What information do you have about other people's perspectives? How can you learn about how they're feeling? So you might not be able to know or even guess right away, but there might be things that have provided some evidence to you about how other people are viewing things, about how other people feel, about how what other people might want in a situation. And so these things can help you be responsive to other people by thinking through some of these things and seeking out an understanding of that other person's perspective. So that's that understanding tool. Does anybody have any questions, comments about that piece before we move to the next one? All right. So choice is what I've used to talk about like the problem framing and problem solving. And again, like I know I mentioned the problem framing piece of it before, but developing clear understanding is what are the problems that need to be solved? It's like what is it that is a problem right now? What is the at issue? What do we need to resolve? Why is this a problem? Like what are the things that are really creating that problem? And what are the criteria that need to be met in order for solutions to resolve it? And the problem solving is taking those acts to carry it out. So with that, a lot of times we talk about things in terms of like interests, but for me personally, like interests, needs, desires, like those things can be somewhat interchangeable. I have a hard time like differentiating between like something that I'm just like really interested in or want really badly versus something I really need. Because like psychologically, like if I want something badly enough, do I need it? For me, it's not an important distinction a lot of the time, but it might be in certain situations. But just overall, this list comes from Center for Nonviolent Communication, but there are various sorts of needs or interest inventories online that you can find. So if this one isn't as helpful for your own kind of thinking or for other people's, there are lots of other ones out there to look through. This one I find helpful with the champ thinking through like these various interests. And when I first learned about this, I learned about it in terms of like positions versus interests. And positions was a little piece at the top of an iceberg. But it's a thing you tend to see. So like, for instance, like someone might say, again, like, I really want that orange. Like that's their position. Like, I want that orange, I should have that orange. But the interests underlying that might be that, like, again, I want to have something nutritious and sweet and delicious to eat. I want to have something that has vitamin C. So maybe there are other things that would meet that interest. Or, maybe, you know, if you're trying to bake a cake, like you want that orange to bake a cake, but like, are there other ways that you can bake that cake? Are there other ways that you can do this? So like, for instance, if you're trying to bake that cake because you're trying to have something for someone's birthday, like maybe there are other things you can do for their birthday. Maybe there are other ways that you can accomplish that. It opens up the range of possibilities when you think about things in terms of interests or needs versus thinking through things just in terms of like that position of like they need the orange. So getting to what's underlying their need for that orange can be an important piece. And so these are things that try to get into that of like, what is it that's underlying the thing that you're saying that you're wanting, the thing that you're saying that you're needing? Is there something that we can break that down to that's a bit more fundamental and might open up a lot of different possibilities out there and might give you a lot more choices that are available that could meet those same interests, that could do the same thing for you? And also over time too, I mean, sometimes, you know, people tend to limit their thoughts to just the immediate situation, the immediate people, the immediate need that they have. But sometimes thinking through their needs over time can be an important aspect, and thinking through how this situation, meeting their needs in this situation, might affect things later on down the line. And maybe there's a greater need that they can meet later on down the line versus trying to meet this immediate need. So that's an element of that choice aspect. But really, what's again important to that is getting beyond just that position and getting into the interests and the needs that need to be met. With harmony, a lot of this, there's not necessarily like specific tools mm, that we have for this one as much as just collected within some of the others. But this, so connecting people's plans with their own personal needs and goals and with their social ecologies. So for for those of you who might not have heard the term like social ecologies or social ecological models before, and one of the things with that is like there's those systems around people so that they're embedded. And these social ecologies can be really important, both in thinking through like how do your own personal needs affect those social ecologies. So are the ways that you're going about trying to meet your needs causing problems for other people, causing harm to other people? Or are the ways that you're going about those things actually like healthy for the people around you or not causing harm to people around you? And also thinking through like, what is it in my community that might be supportive of me in trying to meet my needs? What is it that could be supportive of us if we're in conflict to try to meet our needs and make sure that we are doing this in a way that's not going to cause greater harm to our families, to our schools, to anything like that? So trying to think through those things, again, keeping all of that in mind can be really challenging, but again, can be a really important thing to develop for youth. And so trying to get them to think about these things and practice thinking about those things is a really important thing to build their brains to start thinking about those things more automatically. When we talk about recognition, again, recognizing people's own humanity, their value, the fact that each person like is important, they have value, they have a place in this community is an important aspect, but also recognizing the obligations and commitments that we have. So how is it that we can live in our communities in ways that are healthy for people and for others and for ourselves? And also thinking through the effects of our experiences. And so I'll talk about that piece in a minute. But then all of those things go collectively into engagement. So once you've achieved those other principles, hopefully that gets to where you are activating that self-efficacy for the purposes like carrying out those plans and behaving in ways that are consistent across a lifetime. So I guess that with the last few minutes here in terms of that recognition piece, one of the things I think is really important is accountability to each other. And with that, sometimes something that can be helpful is trying to make amends or apologies. So anytime that there's harm that's caused or any kind of concerns that people bring up about things that they feel like are harmful or not going well, thinking through the fact that like, again, if someone says that they feel harmed by something, accepting that they feel harmed. And it's not to say that, like, the fact that, like, if you think that they are exaggerating it, if you think that they shouldn't feel the way they do, doesn't matter, because if they feel the way that they do, that's a fact for them. So even just acknowledging the fact that people feel harm can be a really important aspect. And then thinking through, like, if there are actions that you took that might cause that, being accountable to those actions can be really important. Thinking through, are there ways that I could behave differently? So even in situations where you might feel like you didn't necessarily do anything quote unquote wrong, if it was harmful, and if there's something that you could do that wouldn't have caused that harm, or if there's something you can do in the future to avoid causing that harm, acknowledging the fact that you could have made a different choice that could have avoided that harm, or acknowledging that you could make a different choice in the future that doesn't cause that harm, isn't saying necessarily that there's anything inherently wrong with what you did before. It's about trying to address that harm and about trying to make sure that you don't cause that again. So thinking through how to move forward with those things, there's research on apology that shows that, like, for apologies to really be the most impactful in terms of providing the most kind of significant positive effects of forgiveness and those kinds of things, meeting these 5 criteria are really important. So making sure that you do these 5 things and avoiding these kinds of things are really important. And I want to give us some time to talk through just questions we have. So move on to forgiveness is a complicated thing. And again, with any of these subjects, these could be hours long conversations, but forgiveness, I think, is kind of a helpful definition, is thinking through, like, a willingness to abandon one's right to resentment, negative judgment, and indifferent behavior toward the offender while fostering the undeserved qualities of compassion and generosity to them. Really, the big piece is, like, acknowledging that I'm choosing to release you from your debt to me. So forgiveness is not about excusing what's happened or condoning it or even trying to reconcile a relationship. Forgiveness is about releasing people from a debt, feeling like there's a burden there. Forgiveness is about releasing your own sense that you need something to happen in order to feel like you can move forward. Some of those things can be really difficult without accountability from other people, without other things. But you, for yourself, it's important to think through, what are the criteria that need to be met? What do I need in order to release someone from their debt to me? What do I need in order to feel like I don't need something more from that person? Is an important aspect of forgiveness. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I know we only have a few more minutes, but somebody have any questions about any of that stuff?
Not so much a question, but just a comment that a lot of the techniques that you're using are very similar to techniques that probation officers use and in effective practices in community supervision, like what you're calling a thinking report. So it's just very interesting that just similar tools, but just an observation. Thank you.
These are tools that are used in a lot of different settings, and you'll see them packaged different ways, called different things, but you can see it in lists of, like, references where a lot of these things came from. But yeah, there are plenty of sort of common common sources for those things, for sure. Well, for those of you who want to talk more about this, like I said, please do uh, send in feedback about this, good, bad, otherwise. Like, I'm totally fine with, like, negative feedback, so please, like, don't worry about that. And the feedback is totally anonymous. But also, I will be there tomorrow for those of you who are joining, and so please, feel free to come say hi. And if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, you can always email me. You have my contact information from that toolkit. But really appreciate you all being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm gonna close out of this one and move to the next one. Yeah. See you, Jeff. Thank you.